It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Cait West, and we're going to be discussing her brand new book, Rift, a Memoir of Breaking Away from Christian Patriarchy. Cait, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Truly my pleasure. I know for the audience who always gets excited about my icebreaker origin story question, we are going to deviate because our whole conversation is broadly going to be about Cait's story, Cait's journey. We're going to go a little bit off the beaten path and start with writing process today. I've talked to many authors through the years who've written memoirs, processed difficult things in their life as they were writing. On the one hand, I always say when we take on writing projects, it's almost always to work out an issue or trying to figure something out or solve our own problem, which I always kind of find ironic. But for you, just with such a difficult journey, a personal journey, talk to us about the balance of the writing journey being both kind of painful and cathartic. I would imagine you kind of vacillated between the two sides along the journey.
Definitely. I went to college to study fiction writing. So I wanted to write novels, and my own story kept bleeding into everything I was writing. So I think it was a sign for myself of I need to write my own story first. So I switched over to studying memoir and creative nonfiction. And it was this way for me to take back the pen and the narrative of my own story when I had been silenced for most of my life. So in that sense, it was very empowering and healing because I was telling my own story in my own voice. On the other hand, it was going and digging deep into traumatic memories and difficult things that had happened to me. And so that was difficult to do, obviously. And it really didn't work out well until I started going to trauma therapy and helping myself process those memories first before I could write about them in a healthy way.
And in terms of, I listened to a number of podcasts in addition to reading the book. 5 years, 6-year journey. How many years did you put into pulling this together? Sound like it took a bit of time.
Yeah, I left the Christian Patriarchy movement about 11 years ago, and I started writing this book about maybe 6 years ago. Probably a little more than that, but yeah. So it's been a long time.
Yeah, indeed. Well, and I would say too, just given that you studied writing novels and such, like I felt like the way this read, it had kind of a sort of a novel, maybe a bit of an artsy kind of flair to it at times. It was, it's, I don't know, short chapters, all the things, perfect for all of us ADD readers who need breaks. So I was like, oh, praise Jesus. What I love about the short chapters is I'll sit and read half the book because I keep getting my little treat because I got to the end of the chapter. I was like, I'll read another chapter. So, I love short chapters. They're a good thing to put in a book.
Okay.
We're gonna jump into a totally different spot just for a moment. But one of the things I thought that was interesting from something I heard you share in an interview was that books for you growing up were something that was less regulated. So talk to us about how books were an escape, allowed you to go places you couldn't maybe sort of in that rest of your life that was more controlled. I thought that was an interesting facet to your story.
Yeah, so I grew up in a very sheltered home and I didn't have access to a lot of outside information. So television and movies, we did have access to some of those, but they were very, very filtered by my parents. And books, on the other hand, I think at the time, my parents viewed them as somewhat more neutral. And so I had access to libraries and my parents bought me a lot of books. And a lot of them were in alignment with their worldview, but some of them were just, fiction stories. And so in the world I grew up in, those were somewhat neutral. But for me, it gave me an opportunity to listen to other ways to live and other people who had different backgrounds or had different choices. And so it gave my imagination something to feed off of when I was so isolated. So it gave me a lot of more room to grow in my own imagination, which eventually gave me the courage to believe and tell my own story.
And in terms of why now for the book, obviously, as you described, like it took time to write, you were working through issues in counseling, and that was part of your process of writing. But maybe from just a timing perspective, I think of why now, as I look back on this conversation 5, 6, 8, 10 years ago, I feel like the church was not as ready to hear your story or hear these conversations as they are today, just given how the landscape has shifted dramatically in this past decade. So, for you, culture, why is this the perfect time for your book to hit the market?
I think about when I left 11 years ago, 2013, and I had zero resources to help me through the process of understanding abuse, whether that was spiritual abuse, emotional abuse. I had access to the internet, and so could start studying the psychology part of it. But in terms of religious trauma and spiritual abuse, those resources were really limited, at least from my perspective. And over the past 10 years, this conversation has grown exponentially. And I think more and more people are telling their stories of harm within churches. And I think that is causing a domino effect, because for so long people have been silenced or have been kept quiet about what's happened to them. And so I don't think the problem necessarily has changed, but I think people are feeling freer to talk about it. So the resources are growing, the stories are becoming more common. We're getting a lot more documentaries. Last year, the documentary Shiny Happy People came out about IBLP and Bill Gothard. And those were the same kinds of teachings that affected my life. So I felt very seen in that documentary. And I know so many other people who did as well. And I think when I tell my story now, people can point to that and say, oh, I watched Shiny Happy People. I have a reference point. I understand. I saw the Duggars on television. So people are having more context of how this is affecting our culture and our country at large. And I think with everything that's going on politically and within the church, I think people are just grasping for an understanding of the bigger context here.
Well, and I would say too, just to my fellow homeschooling moms and dads, some of us who've been down the journey for 20 some years at this point, we rub shoulders with all different sides of the movement. And I think on the one hand, we tend to want to stick our head in the sand and not look at some of the difficult things that are happening within the kind of different parts of the movement as a whole. And I just think we're at a place where we can't ignore it, because, in terms of even the stigma, the things our own kids are going to wrestle with on the other side of their journey into adulthood, they're impacted by these things, whether or not, our stories are the same. I think of even, with my own kids, I look at my first two kids who were very hyper sheltered, and I look at them trying to navigate the world as adults. And I look at some of our children who came after, who are just starting out in adulthood. And I can see how much my wife's and my choices in parenting and homeschooling shifted, even with the third and fourth kid as opposed to the first two. So I feel like stories like yours are really important for all of us to wrestle with, because if we still have kids in the home and we're homeschooling and making choices what we're going to limit and all the things, what happens to them on the other side as they're stepping into adulthood? Like, I feel like I've got time to correct course with these younger kids in a way. Obviously, I'll still help my kids who are out navigating the world, but these choices we make have real world ramifications later on in the lives of our children. So we're definitely worth thinking about, worth wrestling with. I'd love to have
you.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I appreciate you saying that, because for so long, people who are in the homeschooling world or in the church have turned a blind eye to stories like mine, because it's too hard to talk about. It's too much, I think, for a lot of people. So I think that's why we see problems that repeat themselves. And so having people like you who are interested in learning more, even if it's an extreme version of something that you might not experience, it's really encouraging, because that's how we make change.
Amen. We could say that again at the end of the interview, because that's an important thing to point out. We can't ignore it. We shouldn't ignore it. There's nothing wrong with homeschooling in general, but there needs to be grace and balance in all things. And pendulums swing all over the place.
I agree.
That's for sure.
I agree.
In terms of like the word patriarchy, it's got a black eye at this point. Some people want to wear it as a badge of honor, and it's their thing, and it's all over the place. And so, for you, your story, when you say patriarchy, what do you mean? Because I feel like people, based on just their backgrounds, when they hear that word, they're all thinking different things, and it may differ than how you would define it just based on your own experience. So in terms of your story, when you say that, what do you mean?
So I'm specifically talking about something that's called the Christian Patriarchy movement. It also goes by the name of biblical patriarchy, and that is this ideology that believes God is masculine and the ultimate patriarch. And therefore, men are supposed to be patriarchs of their families, and women are to submit. So what that looked like for me as a girl growing up, I was only told my whole life I was going to be a wife and a mother. I wasn't allowed to go to college or have a job or go on dates or have, societally, normal experiences. And it was really harmful to me because it took away my sense of self, my sense of agency. And so that's why I'm talking about that in this context, because Christian patriarchy takes those things very literally. And once I left, I saw patriarchy in different spheres of life, from what complementarianism, which is more of a soft version of patriarchy, to just, socially, our secular culture has patriarchy as well. So I think it overlaps. And I think all of those conversations are important. When I say Christian patriarchy, I'm referring to that movement that I grew up in.
Well, and I kind of smiled as I was reading the book, and you referenced Patriarch magazine, which I know I encountered and saw somewhere at some point of our homeschooling journey, being a part of that world.
You might be the first person who's heard of that.
I know at some point I had a copy given to me by somebody. I know I saw a copy once. Another thing that, reading your story got me thinking about that often isn't talked about is I've seen families where there can be a lot of, because I feel like it's often the wives that pull the family into the homeschooling movement. I've not met a lot of dads who are like, this was my idea. But I have seen situations where, depending on which curriculum somebody uses, or kind of the leaders in the movement that you gravitate towards, obviously they have a lot of sway and influence. And so, I have seen situations where, it was almost more the wives pressuring the husbands, like, hey, this whole patriarchy thing, this is what it means to be a good family. And this is what we need to do. Like there was a couple, my wife and I were a part of some marriage counseling once where they ended up getting a divorce. But it seemed, just sitting in on that, just reading between the lines, it was very upside down, where the expectations almost seemed like the wife wanted this guy to take on hyper patriarchy, and it just wasn't a fit for this guy and not his personality. He wasn't interested. And so it created all this conflict. And I can even say in my wife's and my marriage and our family journey, she very much pushed me in that direction, and we found kind of more of a middle of the road balance. But because of the people she was especially gravitating towards being influenced by, like I feel like it's not always the dad just says, hey, I found this thing, this is what we're going to do. There can often be a lot of pressures on husbands as well. And so that's just a different side of the I guess the conversation. But I was like, I can relate, but it's almost from the opposite direction, if you will. I have been noticing, just with your book and some other books I'm lining up interviews for, that people are starting to use the word cult in some of these situations, and with what was happening in some of the movements they were a part of, or what was specifically happening in their home. Would you apply that label in any way to your journey? I'm just curious, because in some other books, similar stories, like they're using that language as well. I don't know that I've seen it used as much in this particular context.
Yes, I do use the word cult, and a lot of times I say something like cult-like or cult-ish, just because that word is so loaded, and a lot of people have really strong feelings about that for various reasons, and I totally get that. For me, I like to base my understanding of a cult on the research done by people like Robert Lifton and Stephen Hassan and Yanya Lalich, they've done a lot of research into what high control groups and high control communities look like and those red flags. And so using that research, I can apply that to my experience and see that, yes, I was in a cult-like environment. And so there's different layers to that. In my family, you know, my father was the patriarch. So he was in a sense like a mini cult leader, right, of the family. And we were taught to be like that. And we were taught to be like that from the church, which perhaps you could also see as a cult, the specific church that I was in, where we had a charismatic leader. There was a lot of information control, a lot of fear, you know, all this hierarchy and authoritarianism. And so I see those cult-like aspects in my family and in the church that I grew up in. And I think this whole movement that I'm speaking about in the book, it encourages that kind of behavior.
Next, I'd love to have you give us a window into, you know, for your family or for your dad, depending on where kind of the impetus was there. Like, how did the journey into homeschooling and the patriarchy movement get started? Where were the kind of the beginnings for your family? Because a lot of times we step into something, we're looking for a framework or a system to have a better family, a better life, have some structure, especially if, you know, I've had friends who came out of like completely non-religious home and they gravitate towards independent fundamentalist baptism. So like the complete polar opposite extreme, because they want that hyper structure. So, and a lot of times I feel like our intentions as we step into something can be good. Like we're just looking something to make things better. So like for your family, where did this journey get started?
Yeah, 100%. I think I've seen so many people fall into this movement who just want a healthy family. They want to follow God. They want to follow the Bible. And they get pulled in by leaders who are teaching really toxic doctrine. So for my family specifically, I think I talk about this in the book a little bit. I can't provide any diagnosis or a concrete answer from my experience of witnessing what happened. My father has authoritarian tendencies already. And so I think his journey into this movement rewarded those tendencies and encouraged him in them so that he could take more control over our family. And I see it working that way. I don't think everybody in this movement goes into it like that. I see a lot of families, like you said, where the wife or the mother is more of the push to get into it. So that just wasn't my experience in my family, but I've seen it different ways. I think people go into it because they want to find belonging. And then there's also people who go into it because they want to control other people. So I think it can be both.
But next, I'd love to have you share the story. And this was very early on in the book. And as a dad, it really made me sad. You talk about how I think that it was 1 year it was okay for you as a little, probably 4-year-old at that point, to wear a 2-piece swimsuit. A year later, same circumstances, you're 5, and all of a sudden the 2-piece swimsuit was off limits and there was something wrong and shameful there. Just talk to us about just that confusing circumstance for a little girl. Like, how do you even process that? It was fine last year, but this summer it's not. Like, what changed?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the other side of it. I imagine I had grown. My father probably had gotten more into these strict beliefs about gender and the ideas of modesty and what that should look like. For me, all I remember is, you know, I had this swimsuit. I put it on one summer, and then my father told my mother to tell me to go change. And so I witnessed that interaction. This is one of my earliest memories. And I just felt all this shame because for some reason, something was wrong with the way I looked. And I mean, I was a little girl. There's nothing sexual about a 5-year-old. And I just internalized that idea that, you know, this little bit more of skin showing was evil or wrong, or it could cause temptation. Like, that's literally what I was being taught. And I was being taught at the same time this Calvinist theology of I'm an evil person. So I internalized all of that, and I felt a lot of shame about my body, which has been a journey ever since of trying to deconstruct that and reconstruct a healthy sense of body image, So yeah, I can speculate, my parents wanted to do the right thing and they were taught a certain thing about modesty. I don't think that was the right approach. But it's just the way how I internalized it.
Yeah, I mean, as I think of all the different aspects of the parts of the homeschool movement, families I've encountered, I mean, some people wear dresses down to the floor, some people wear jumpers, some people have hair that almost goes down to their ankles. Like it is intriguing the steps we take to somehow illustrate externally that we're set apart from the world. It's like we're trying not to fit in yet, and we don't want attention yet. We're trying to stand out so you notice us at the same time.
Yes.
I guess just continuing on, sort of on that trajectory of clothing choices, how especially I feel like the burden is all on young women, how they're supposed to look, how they're supposed to present themselves. Don't cause that brother to sin. Watch out for that. From like maybe as you saw in your own journey and other friends people you knew in your circles, like as you're growing up, like how does that kind of mess with you in terms of like what can you be proud of? What is it just this huge burden of shame? Like obviously I've never lived my life through a girl's eyes, so I don't know quite what that's like. I think I have a bunch of teenage daughters right now. We have 6 girls. I think of the normal drama we have around clothing and how I look, and I'm fat this week, and this other thing, and this boy, and whatever. Like there's so much drama with all the hormones and everything going on. But then you throw all of these other things to carry and be burdened with on top of it. That had to be really difficult.
For sure. I think, now that I've been gone for so long, I can see this kind of pressure in a lot of young women, whether they're in churches or not, to be a certain size or to look a certain way. And I think the way I grew up in purity culture and in patriarchal hierarchies, there's this extra pressure of adding divine kind of importance to your purity. So it's weighing it so heavily that if you make a wrong move, if your button comes undone, you're committing a crime that's making you worthy of going to hell. Like that's literally what I was taught, and so many girls are taught. And so you start feeling like your body is something's wrong with your body just because you're female. And that's really difficult to maintain a healthy sense of self when you're being taught that and then forced to cover up all the time and not feeling comfortable in your own skin. It's just really difficult. And I think for me with purity culture, it's this impossible ideal of you have to be this ultra feminine body, but you also can't be sexy or you can't be overly tempting. And then everything you do could affect the men around you. So even as a child, I'm being told that I could be causing grown men to sin. And so that's really confusing for a young person to think about when you don't even understand sexuality yet. And it's really unhealthy. I think it creates a lot of toxic dynamics and sets up children to be abused because they don't understand things like consent or bodily autonomy, those kinds of concepts. So I think it really does matter in a very serious way. Sometimes we like to focus on like the modesty aspect, but it gets to your core sense of self and safety as well.
Well, and I think of elementary age or middle school age kids or somebody who's hyper sheltered, kind of being faced with, oh, don't cause this adult person to lust or sin. Is like, well, A, I don't even know half the time what you're talking about. And B, yes. why is that my problem if somebody has a sin issue? I mean,
right, exactly.
It's interesting. For much of my career, I've been in ministries in the Christian publishing space and whatnot, and you kind of see grown-up versions of these things work itself out in policies. Or like I had a new place I'd started working, and one of the first conversations I had with my boss, who was a girl, who's a good friend of mine now. But when we were starting out, she's like, "Are you going to have issues riding in the car with me?" And I'm like, "I have no clue what we're even talking about here." And she's like, "Well, some of the older guys here, they kind of take that Billy Graham approach where they won't even be alone with a woman who's not their wife." And I was just like, well, I was like, well, since and this is in Christian publishing, little secret here, the majority of the people who work in PR and marketing and Christian publishing is all women. Having guys work in that space is really unique. And I was like, well, one, if we're so pathetic that, we are alone in a car together and we just throw off our marriage vows and go crazy, that's sad. Hopefully we're not those people. And the second thing is, the whole team is women. So if I'm not comfortable riding in a car with women, that means we can't travel, we can't do our job. So that's kind of a grown up in the workplace manifestation, I think, of some of these ideas where it's like, do we not have the character that we can't keep our hands off it? Like, it was such a weird, I would have never expected to be asked a question like that in the workplace. But I think you're seeing just like the ongoing working out of some of these ideas. Now, don't get me wrong. If God convicts you in that way, or you are prone to be tempted and sin in that way, by all means, avoid what you need to avoid. But just the practical working out of that in that context was a little bit, I tried not to laugh. I was like, that really, that was, so anyhow, all that to say, with what we're planting in our kids' heads as they're growing, like, these things have real consequences as they try to live and navigate the world, all the things.
Yeah. And not just for girls. I think I always like to say also that it affects boys too. I think you're teaching boys that they have no control, that they're animals, and they have no sense of respect for other people. And so I think you're also setting them up for serious problems and how they treat women. And I've seen that a lot of young boys growing up in this, they have struggles with self-esteem and confidence because of what they're taught about who they are as boys. So I think it hurts everybody, that kind of teaching.
Yeah, oddly, it's almost like you're setting it up. All men are predators, and all women and girls are victims. Like it paints kind of a sad picture, to say the least. Well, I think too, when we spiritualize everything, like to this nth degree, where God's not happy with us if we break any of these rules, or it gets really conflated and confusing. Where if I defy mom or dad or whatever it might be, I'm also completely disappointing God. My salvation is lost. All the thing. I mean, that's so much pressure for anybody to carry. And those things that get really stuck in us in childhood, we have to wrestle with those same things as adults. Like if we get into situations, that tape starts playing in our head of that thing from back in the day, and we have to be like, oh wait, that's not true, or that's not right. And so, yeah, just it is interesting, just the hyper spiritualization of everything, and that, mom and dad's authority is equivalent to God's authority, or the pastor's authority is equivalent. It's just, wow, for people who don't have the character to wield that power and influence well, it is a recipe for disaster when it goes off the rails, and it can go off the rails really, really hard. And this is I guess just kind of a side road. Like, one of the things that fascinates me as a guy who works behind the scenes in publishing, I have been a part of decisions to cancel projects and do things because it is found out a pastor or a leader committed some terrible, awful sin 25 years ago. And it was hidden, it wasn't dealt with well, and then finally it comes out. And I think the thing that grieves me and just makes me be like, man, can we please wake up and stop doing this? It's one thing if you're youth pastor level starting out and you do something that is worthy of church discipline or whatever else needs to be dealt with, deal with it then, before it can have all these massive ramifications and fallout. You wait another 20, 30 years, even if the trajectory, the sin doesn't continue, maybe that person cleans up their act. When that thing comes out again, that it wasn't dealt with well, and it will come out again, I kid you not, don't worry, it'll come out. The fallout for how it destroys ministries and families and careers and everything else, because the further we go on our own journey, like our influence or everything, it grows over time as our world grows, our relationships grow. And if there's one thing that I've seen this enough times over and over again, it's like, leaders, we need to get a clue, deal with stuff at the time it's happening, believe victims and move in a direction to figure out what do we do legally, spiritually, all the things, but don't just slide things under the rug, because the bomb that drops 25, 30 years later, it's just, the fallout is catastrophic. And I can't say that enough times, because it makes me sad to see not only that somebody suffered in silence for multiple decades waiting for this wrong to be righted, but just the way it destroys churches, ministries, everything. I don't know. I wish we'd pick up the clue phone and understand that we need to stop doing that. But I feel like we see that over and over.
Mm-hmm. And then the victims are left alone, just to suffer through those years without any support as well. So yeah, it's not a good situation.
I'll get off my soapbox for a moment. We'll keep going. But again, these are things just with my vantage point in the publishing industry and everything else. Like, I just see different sides of it where it's like, man, we need to do better. In terms of just, I guess maybe trajectory, I feel like, I'm guessing your dad didn't start out in the same place that he kind of ended. Like the trajectory of control increasing, or maybe kind of your world shrinking around you. Like, what did that look like over time? Were there certain things that impacted that for him, or like as you've tried to wrestle with and understand it, why did the control grow through the years?
I think I see this radicalization because of, dynamic leaders who were teaching these things. My dad became a born-again Christian when he was around 20 years old after being Catholic. And I think I wasn't there, obviously, but I've heard that story so many times of how he got saved. And then, fast forward 10 or so years later, he's listening to a lot of, ultra-conservative media, getting information about the growing homeschooling movement, which, especially at the time in the 90s, was very religiously based. And I believe it's pretty different than it is now, but I think that context still matters. And so, he pulled me out of a private school and I started homeschooling. I was the first kid to homeschool in my family. And from there, it just became more and more strict the more he got deep into these beliefs. And I see that with other things like conspiracy theories or movements where your information gets limited and your horizon gets really small and you get ultra focused on an ideal or a goal. And so I think on the one hand, he was getting control, which I think he's an authoritarian type of person. On the other hand, he's being told if he does this, his family will be blessed and it will be honoring to God. And so that goal was hyper-focused on to the point where we were blind to any other information. And so that, the information that we got was coming from things like Patriarch Magazine, which was a newsletter that was kind of like a grassroots newsletter that homeschoolers would share, and homeschooling conventions, and people like Doug Wilson who preach ultra patriarchy. Those teachers and these materials were in our home all the time. We constantly listened to these tapes and read the books. So it was very much part of our family culture. And so I think it was just a natural tendency to get more and more extreme because of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think of just being part of the homeschool movement for 20-some years. I mean, I feel like Vision Forum, people watching the Duggars on TV, there are different things that I kind of, gateway drug isn't the right way to say it, but it was sort of, you got the Vision Forum catalog, you bought some cool stuff for your kids because they sold interesting toys. I'm going to get a few DVDs and some books. And there were some very influential ministries and voices that, presented this material from a large stage, would be a way to say it, in terms of their influence. And I think every family has to wrestle with what do you do with that sort of information. And, I think just as people normally do, if something gravitates you gravitate towards something, you tend to surround yourself with those same people. And then all of a sudden you just live inside this bubble and you think everybody thinks this way. But that is obviously not the case. In terms of kind of growing up, you turned 18, graduated, all the things like and in terms of being expected to be a stay-at-home daughter, like what did life look at? Because I feel like, for the average person who's not as familiar with these sorts of circles, they might be surprised at the level of restriction you still had as an adult in terms of going out in the world and living life, finding yourself, whatever you might say.
Yeah. I was told that I was a child until I got married. And as a child, I was under my father's headship. So I didn't understand that I had legal rights as an adult. I wasn't given that information. And so I had to obey my father in every aspect of my life, every decision. And so he controlled, everybody that I interacted with, not being able to work outside the home, not being able to go to college. And that kept me very restricted and isolated. A lot of my friends who grew up in this movement had a lot of younger siblings, and they became like second mothers to these younger kids. And something we call parentification, where you're putting these adult responsibilities on young people without their consent. And so I witnessed that as well. It depends on what family you grew up in. I only had one younger brother, so he didn't need babysitting or anything like that. But I was shipped out to other homes to be a mother's helper for other families with little children. And that was my practice to become a mother. And I'm not going to say it's all bad. I think I learned certain skills, but I didn't have a choice in this at all. And I think that's what's important here is I didn't have the choice to decide if that's what I wanted to do. And I know that some people do want to stay home after they turn 18. And if their parents are okay with that, that's their choice. But for me, it wasn't a choice. And so I think that's a really vital piece of information is if somebody has a sense of agency in their own life.
Well, and like this kind of a thing, like it's not a struggle for me, but like I believe motherhood is a high calling. Like I can say my wife wanted to be home with children from when she was 2. Like it was what she wanted to do. She wanted to have lots of kids. And if that's your calling, and I think if you're going to have 10 kids like we did, it's going to need to be a calling because it's difficult to have that many children in the house. Yeah. But if that's not your calling, that shouldn't necessarily have to be thrust upon you. I think that's one of the weird blind sides of this part of the movement is, basically you just prepare your daughters to become a wife and be at home barefoot and pregnant and running a household. Again, that's great if that's your calling and that's what you want to do. By all means, step into that. But it's just a little weird to say that that's everybody's calling. Like not everybody has a passion for that. Yet we want to tend to paint with that crazy broad brush. In terms of courtship, dating, like for me, again early on in the movement, I'm thinking like, man, I got to manage this whole courtship thing down the road. What the heck does that look like? And I have one daughter who is dating. I think she's going to get engaged at the end of the summer. I just think of the insanity it would be for me to try to manage all aspects and control all aspects of their relationship. Like that would drive me nuts. Yet in kind of and this isn't even extreme forms, just working out what this side of the movement says is what is expected. And this is what it means to do a good job as a dad to protect your children. It's a lot. Talk to us about the dynamics of, can't even say, it's not dating, just courtship. If somebody has no clue what that looks like, it's a little different.
Yeah, I think someone might have a base understanding of courtship from a book like I Kissed Dating Goodbye, like the Purity Culture book by Josh Harris, which he has since recanted. But for my family and for my church, we took a pretty extreme approach to this. We used a book called The Pathway to Christian Marriage, which sounds pretty culty in my opinion. And this guidebook gave you all these rules for what courtship should look like, all the principles. Every other sentence had a Bible verse attached to it. So it has this appearance of being this is what God wants you to do. And so it's very much a proof texting, like literal translation of Old Testament stories like Isaac and Rebecca, or, where Abraham finds a wife for his son. Those kinds of stories were taken very literally, and courtship principles were pulled from those. I think a side note is a lot of those stories include things like polygamy, which we didn't practice. So clearly they were cherry picking the verses that they wanted to use. But it was a very strict process. You couldn't just go out and find somebody that you wanted to be with. The idea was like you would probably meet somebody at church, and your father would be able to witness whether this person was mature enough to get married. And then that young man would ask the father of the daughter if they could have a courtship. And so if the father said yes, then the father would mediate this relationship. And so it was supposed to be like a few months long. There was very, very specific questions that you would go through with this other person and your dad. And at the end of the process, your dad would decide if you could get married or not. And they got around this by saying we could say yes to getting married. So we had the choice to say yes. That was their way of trying to make it seem like it wasn't an arranged marriage. But when you live in this kind of environment, there's not a lot of choices for you. So to say no would have been a big deal, especially if it's somebody that your father wants you to get married to. So, those lines are really gray when you grow up in a high control situation. So a lot of girls got married and are now divorced. They've had abusive marriages and really troubled relationships. And it grieves me a lot to see that these families were promised these results. Your children are going to grow up, they're going to be happy, they're going to be godly in this very specific way. And then they grow up and they get married according to the process, and they end up with broken homes or a brokenness that they have to heal and work through. And I've seen so many women work through that, and I'm so proud of them. But it wasn't fair that they had to go through that. So I've seen the results of this. It's really devastating.
Well, I think it sounds really good at the beginning, where it's like, well, if you just follow all these rules and do all these right things, all your kids are going to turn out great. It's going to be perfect. It's going to be wonderful. And I think when we're young and we have little kids, we're really naive. Talk to people who've actually launched kids into the world and have had, wayward children or children who, fall outside of the nest, if you will. And just, I think there are sometimes we should seek out other folks who have other perspectives, but it seems really appealing. But I always tell people when they're, they think they've been the perfect parents. And I was like, launch a few of them into adulthood, get them married and all the things, and then talk to me about all the things you've learned about how you were or were not a perfect parent. Because even in those latter stages, you see the fruit of how you raise them. You see yourself reflected in what they're doing and how they're operating in the world. Sometimes it's like, oh man, they really captured that for me. Other times, like, that is like the worst aspect of me that you're displaying out in the world. Oh my gosh, what do I do with that? But it's easy to be taken in by this just fairy tale vision of like, if you just do this all right, everything will turn out. That's just not real life. It doesn't always turn out perfect.
And it doesn't take into account that children are human beings with
absolutely
their own sense of self, their own free will. And so I think in my church, children were taught like we were basically robots. If you put in the right code and you put in the right teaching, they're going to end up doing what you want them to do for the rest of their lives. So we weren't treated as full human beings. And I think that's a really missing piece to this puzzle of treating children like human beings with choices. And you give them the information, and then they get to make those decisions as they get older, age appropriate decisions.
Yes, our kids do have to have a level of self and autonomy, and they are their own individual beings, and they are not carbon copies of us. They're going to go and do things we never expected. Reminds me of so many of the conversations I've had with fiction authors where they set out to write a story, and by the end of it, all of the characters do things they never imagined was going to happen throughout the journey with the book. And I would say that with 10 kids, the stuff my kids are doing now is things I never would have envisioned, even based on how we tried to raise them. And so it's an adventure. If you give your kids a little bit more freedom, they're going to go directions you never expected, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Talk to us about meeting your husband, David, and the escape. I mean, I think that's a part of your story. People, because with every good story of somebody coming out of a hard situation like this, there's always an escape, because otherwise you wouldn't be here telling your story.
That's true. When I met David, I was in another courtship with somebody, and that's a long story that's in the book about what that was. A very pivotal moment for me in understanding who I was and what I wanted. And that courtship failed, and I became really close friends with David, who was in our church, and his family was less patriarchal than mine. And so the things that were happening in my home were not his experience, the things like spiritual abuse and emotional abuse. And we tried to have a courtship, and my father let us do it for like 1 week, and then he changed his mind, which gives you a glimpse into the kind of parenting he had. And then we decided to just continue our relationship without his approval, which led to a lot of really disruptive family dynamics. I felt like I was tearing my family apart by following my own dreams and my own intuition in this relationship. And it was a really big struggle for me, because I wanted to do the right thing. Like, I really thought first, up until this point, I was at the age of 24, I thought that if I obey my father in every single thing, God will reward me, right? And so here I was falling in love, feeling like, is this what God wants? Or is this, my dad's calling me a rebellious person? And it was just this internal struggle that went on for quite a while. And eventually this relationship showed me what unconditional love can look like. I think up until that point, I had experienced so much control and so much conditional love, where if I follow the rules, if I do these certain things, that's when I feel loved. But if I break the rules, then I could be banished. I could be excommunicated. I could be cut off from the family. So I had those extremes in my life. So when I experienced unconditional love from David, it opened my heart in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And it gave me this courage to step out for myself. And we eventually left. At the time, we were living in Hawaii, and we moved to Michigan, where David's from, and we got married here. And it's been a journey ever since of supporting each other. But he was able to see the struggles I was going through and affirm me as a person. And he cared about my opinion and what I wanted with my life. And he's been a really supportive partner ever since. And we've been able to work through stuff together, which I'm really grateful for, because it's really difficult to leave a situation like this as a single woman. I know very few stay-at-home daughters who got out on their own. So it's very tricky to do that without resources. Yeah.
Well, and on the other side of that, I'll ask you a question in a minute about just navigating job, college, all the things. Like I'll go back to my two oldest children. Now that they're both adults and doing what they're doing, I realize how much we really over sheltered them, where I'm surprised. Like, there are things that I just assumed they should know. And there have been conversations with, I didn't even know that was an option, or I had a choice, or, and I was like, how do you not know this? This should be like, this is everybody knows this, but again, it's really eye opening. Like, wow. Okay. And so, again, I go back to what we do throughout that whole journey, sets up for how prepared or not prepared they are, for what they're going to encounter out there in the world. For you, what were some of the maybe challenges you faced, like going out and finding a job, choosing to go to college, all the things? Like, you were not trained for this. You were supposed to be a stay-at-home mother after being a stay-at-home daughter. So what was it like to figure out to navigate what, for the majority of young women your age, this is just normal life, but a lot of it was brand new to you?
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, it was super exciting because I could make my own decisions and explore the world, and I felt so liberated. And on the other hand, I didn't know how to make decisions. And I didn't know how to discern what was right and wrong for me, because those rules had always been external to me. So that was the struggle, especially the first few years. And finding a job, it took me a long time to find a job because I didn't have really any work experience. I was allowed to teach piano lessons when I was a stay-at-home daughter. So I started doing that after I left, and then eventually got a job at a bakery. And I talk in my book about how I think that was because I put church pianist on my resume, and the bakery owner happened to be a Christian. So I felt like there was something to do with that. And that's how I got that job. And having the job itself was, we were broke. I was getting paid minimum wage. And it was really, really hard time. At some point, it was like, are we going to have enough to pay the bills? But we worked as much as we could and, survived during that time. And for me, it was a really beautiful part of my life because I learned that I could take care of myself. And I did the risky thing by leaving. I did the scary stuff by going out of my comfort zone at the age of 25 into a world I knew very little about and was able to figure it out, and I was really grateful for things like libraries and community college. And one of my first teachers at the community college, when I started taking like 2 classes there because I knew I wanted to get an education. And one of the first teachers was so kind to me and showed me how to take a test and how to write an essay, these things that I hadn't learned because in the homeschooling environment that I grew up in, girls weren't prioritized, right? So my education wasn't very, very strong before that point. And I met so many kind people. And in this world that I was told was going to be scary and evil, so many people were kind from all sorts of backgrounds. And they really helped me find myself and find a way to live and survive. And now I don't feel like I'm surviving anymore. I feel like I'm just living my life.
And one of the things I heard you talk about in one of the podcast interviews I listened to is eventually you came to a place where you realized you had PTSD. And so I'd love for you to just talk about on this side of the journey, whether it's going to counseling, having to wrestle with what does it mean for you to have a relationship with God? I mean, you've talked about deconstruction in some of your interviews. Just on this side of it, trying to figure out the dynamics of what does it mean for you to just walk out your faith and live in this world without the burdens of everything that was heaped upon you throughout childhood and growing up. Like, I'd love to hear just like, I don't know, probably not right to say that you arrived in the place where you're going to end, but like, where have you ended up at this point in your journey? Because I know you've done a lot of work to get where you are right now.
Right. And I think that word deconstruction has become very popular lately. And
it's a loaded term,
I feel like
depending on who you're talking to.
It is very loaded. And for me, I left this very strict movement. And so that immediately meant I had to deconstruct or understand what the teachings were. And so I immediately dove into picking apart what I had been taught, where were these ideas coming from, who was speaking them, and learning about what I believe. And I did go to a church for a while after I left, and I would call them like a conservative evangelical church. At first, it was really nice because it didn't feel very strict. But over time, I saw really subtle clues that there were some issues. I witnessed an abusive marriage get treated really poorly by the church leadership, and to the point where the wife had to leave the church on her own to go find a safer church to go to. I saw the patriarchal teachings come back into this church in Sunday school as teaching materials. And when I brought these things up, all of a sudden I was an apostate because I had questioned I don't know, the church leaders. And that's putting this into a really brief story, but this is, years long of me trying to figure out what I believed and trying to speak up for what I was seeing happening, because spiritual abuse happens a lot in churches and families. And I wanted to bring awareness to that. And there was some people interested, but a lot of resistance. And so it became to the point for me, I was diagnosed with PTSD and OCD, a religious, what we call scrupulosity, where it's like an ethical OCD where you're constantly obsessing over right and wrong. So for me in a church situation, it became really unlivable to go to a church building, be taught more rules to do, feel like I was policed, for what I said and my questions. It was just a really unhealthy place for me to be in. And so now when I work with spiritual abuse survivors, I want them to feel like there's no agenda for your endpoint here. We want you to feel seen and heard and to navigate your own healing. I think that self-agency is a really big part of that. So for me, I couldn't completely do that until I left church. And I know not everybody's going to make that decision. That was just the right decision for me. And I think I felt so much healthier without that environment that I've been able to think through what I believe now. And I hold things much more loosely. And so I don't think everyone's going to agree where I am at the moment with the way I think about God or the earth or creation, all of those things. I feel like sometimes I use the word agnostic just because I feel like I'm in a place of I feel safe in the not knowing. And I don't feel like I need to follow certain rules to get divine favor. And a lot of people probably aren't going to like that I'm there, but that's just where I am right now. And it feels like a much healthier place than I was 5-10 years ago, where I felt like I need to do this, this, and this, or God's going to hate me, Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it intrigues me that you said you're just choosing to take an agnostic position on some of these things, which to me says you're at a place where like, at some point I'll make some of my own decisions about these things, because you were in a position where growing up, you were told what to think about everything, and it was so structured, and you weren't really even allowed to have your own opinion. So to get to a place where like, I'm not sure, get some of these things I'm going to put on pause, and I'm just going to choose to say, I don't necessarily need to have an opinion about these things right now. Like I feel like that's a sensible place to land in terms of your healing journey. So I can't say I'm surprised that that's how you're feeling right now. I was going to ask you about, do you find traditional church power structure triggering, which you already answered, so I won't even have to ask that question. But I think as leaders and pastors, we do need to be sensitive to, just because people ask hard questions doesn't mean they're trying to destroy something. I think the difficult thing I've noticed through the years, because again, with where I am in publishing, almost all of my friends are pastors and leaders of some sort at some church. But one of the blind sides we can have is some of these hard questions. Gosh, they never went over that in seminary. Or this is things are really so hard and so like some of these issues are so complex. It's not a quick fix, and you may have to, if you really want to step into something, that could mean discipling somebody, investing in somebody, going on a multi-year journey just to love somebody and invest in them. It's complicated. What you're working out of, there's no easy or simple fix. Like, it's a journey to get to where you are now and to where you want to eventually end up. And so I think we can be too quick to dismiss people because what they're asking just flies in the face of what we want to do, or there's no easy way to address that. And that doesn't mean we should just cast people by the wayside because it's difficult, but it means giving something of yourself to step into their world and their situation. And that can be hard. It's, I keep saying this on podcasts lately. it's going to cost you something. And that's a choice. We have to choose whether or not we're going to invest and see the person. And, whether it's your story or somebody else's story, I think we need to move past the quick hit evangelism and discipleship stuff of the 90s and early 2000s, what a lot of us were raised on. That doesn't necessarily work for people are people throughout history, but yet I feel like some of the specific problems people are facing, like we're gonna, it's not this macro level situation. It's loving the person and seeing the person and really serving and going on the journey with the person, and seeing them and not their issue. And so I get it's complicated. I know everybody's busy, but again, to like your story, for somebody where power structures, hierarchy, all that is very triggering and difficult and just brings back a lot of hurt. I asked the question, if somebody had responded to you differently, and I'm not saying you've ended up in the wrong place or the bad place, but how you were responded to definitely affected the trajectory of your journey. And so we need to be conscious of that. If we just write somebody off because they asked a hard question, maybe that person isn't going to have access to counseling or the tools and the resources you have had access to, and they're going to end up in a far different place. So it's not a trivial thing how you respond. You really do need to think through how you respond to difficult questions. Goodness.
And we talk about,
please, go ahead.
On that, just a side note, we talk about PTSD and how people develop PTSD. If you've been through something traumatic, if you have immediate support and care and protection after that traumatic event, if it's like a one-time event, you are more or less likely to have PTSD. So we're seeing in churches people going through abusive situations and then not being believed or not being cared for, and then that just escalates the harm, right? So, yeah, I just want to note to what you're saying.
Perfect. I like the extra commentary. That's important. Well, and also too, the more you heap on somebody that none of us believe you, that makes people crazy. It pushes people to be like, am I the one who's just nuts at this point? If nobody will listen to me, nobody will see me, nobody will hear me, let alone to the things that led somebody to get into that place. I know some people are wondering, what's your ongoing relationship like with your family, your mom, your dad, your siblings? I know the answer to some of this because I listened to a bunch of interviews with you. But just I'll add this before I let you answer. I think some of the boundaries you've set to me is permission to people. It's okay to choose to have boundaries and not be in relationship with certain people. That's not necessarily an unloving thing. It's okay. You need to take care of yourself. So I'll let you answer now. But family dynamics for you, how you relate to your parents and your siblings, what does it look like on this side of your journey?
Well, I'll start with my siblings. All of my siblings have left this movement and have found different ways to live. We've all have very different stories, and I'm really proud of all of us. We got together a couple years ago for the first time all together since for 10 years. And that was such a healing moment. We could connect again as adults and learn how to interact with each other after all of these things that we've been through. So that's an ongoing process, and I'm really grateful that I have relationships with all of them. I have 3 siblings. I know that's not always the case in these situations, so I'm really grateful for that. I do have contact with my mother, and it's somewhat limited because she's married to my dad, and my dad and I don't have contact anymore. As of a few years ago, I tried to set some boundaries on when he could contact me and what kind of conversations we could have, and he didn't like that. So he cut off communication at that point. And I feel okay with that now. There's grief and there's pain in that, but it's also lets me be myself without worrying about if he's going to call me or, in the middle of the night and tell me I'm wrong about something. Those kinds of things were happening, and the PTSD was, coinciding with that. And I was having really extreme reactions to interacting with him. So it was really unhealthy for me. So Yeah, I think people should have the permission to set boundaries so that they can stay healthy. Mental health is a really important thing. It's better that you are here and alive than that you are trying to repress yourself just to have a shallow relationship with somebody who might be hurting you. And that's where I'm at, So I think I feel fine with that now. I think it's something I've processed. It's taken time, and it's just where things are, and that's who I am.
And in terms of, and I'm going to assume that there are thousands and thousands of people who can relate to your story, just given how big these movements were over the past few decades, for the person who says, oh my gosh, I just see my story in Cait's story. And also I would say for people like myself who've been part of the homeschooling movement as parents through the years, like why is it important for these stories? Why is it important for the people who feel like they're a victim like you were to be able to tell their story, but also for those of us who are part of the movement who, have influence and are leaders, whatnot, why do we need to listen and hear what's being said? Like those are the two sides to me of this equation.
I think survivor stories matter. That's one of my biggest mottos is it matters to be seen and to be witnessed and to be heard, because that's what's healing, right? And for something like homeschooling, we see organizations, I'm sure you know the HSLDA, which markets itself as supporting homeschooling families, but really they're pushing for something called parental rights, which I'm sure we could have a conversation about, but what they're missing is children's rights and a child's right to a quality education, to access to mandatory reporters, to having support if they are experiencing abuse at home. Way too many states have little to no regulations on homeschooling. And so organizations like the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, that's the kind of organization I would recommend supporting, because they are working to help with government regulations to protect children and that they have access to these supports. I think for me, homeschooling was a bad experience, but I know so many people who find it really helpful. And it depends on your family and what you want to do as a family. So I really believe that we should make homeschooling safe for everybody. And so even if you are in a good situation and you feel like these issues don't apply to your family, it applies to the whole community, right? Because if one child is being abused at home and not getting the support they need, I think it affects the whole community. So I think that's why it's important for everybody to pay attention to. It's not going to harm homeschooling families to protect children. It might be annoying sometimes to have to go through extra regulations, but for me, I was left on my own a lot of the times. I was just like, here's some books, go read them by yourself. That's not a good education, right? So it's just, yeah, I think there's just too many children who are being neglected, and homeschooling provides a cover for abusive parents. And I'm not saying that people go into homeschooling most of the time to do that, but that does happen. So supporting those organizations, spreading the word, creating awareness so that if this happens to somebody you know where to go, where to get help. And we can work to make homeschooling a safer place for children.
And you've sort of already answered my next question, but in terms of additional resources besides your new book, other books that you found helpful, or you've got a podcast, other things that if people want to kind of, I want to say, take a step down this rabbit hole, like where should they even start?
Okay. So I have several resources. I work with a nonprofit called Tears of Eden, and we support survivors of spiritual abuse within the evangelical church. And so we have a podcast, we have a blog, we have virtual support groups to support survivors. And we don't have an agenda for for you. If you want to come to us for resources, we're going to help you wherever you are, whether that's holding your faith or you don't want to talk about faith. It's for anybody. And then my podcast is called Survivors Discuss. I have this with a couple of friends of mine, and we platform survivors and experts to talk about high control religion and when religion can go wrong. And we're not anti-religion. I wanted to make that clear, is even if I don't follow something, I support people in the religion that they want to believe. Which leads me to my last resource, which is a book called When Religion Hurts You by Dr. Laura Anderson. And she's an expert in religious trauma. And I feel like she is one of the wisest voices on this. She approaches it with compassion, with understanding that people are coming from all sorts of different perspectives on faith. But she's speaking so clearly about abuse within religious environments. And it's so specific. I think a lot of the times in the survivor community, we point to a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is about PTSD. And Dr. Anderson is taking that research and expounding on it and applying it to spiritual abuse and religious trauma. And I think that's really important to be that specific about it, because it is very different. I think there is this extra layer of feeling like, I think your spirituality is such a big part of who you are, and to have it abused and taken advantage of by other people is just really damaging. So I highly recommend that book, and she has a couple podcasts as well, so to check out her resources.
And Cait, in terms of the listeners and viewers connecting with you, finding out about the book, all the things, where do we find you on the web?
My website is caitwest.com, and I spell my first name Cait. That's where you can find links to pre-order the book, and I have a resource page there as well if you want more resources. And I'm also on a lot of social media at Cait West Writes. So that includes Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and I try to make content that's helpful when I can. I'm not always very good at writing things, but because the writing is what I want to do versus making videos. But I try to spread myself around on the different social media. So you can find me in most places.
Yes, the bane of every author's existence of having to be a promoter, doing social media, so many, especially people who are writers and editors, they would rather squirrel themselves away to a place with a nice cup of coffee and do work rather than doing videos on the internet. We'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to websites, social media profiles, books mentioned, all the things. So it'll all be lined up. You can click on through, check out the resources that you want to check out. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Cait West. Once again, our book today was Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. And Cait, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much.